Hello and welcome to the Petticoated Swashbuckler. My name is Marin and we're playing with silk today. I am swathed in silk. I am also slowly, steadily working my way through an inventory that was made around 1780 and which lists the wearing apparel and other things of a late Mrs. Bamford, an Englishwoman. Now I've made a fair bit of her wardrobe already, still more to come. One of the things that you really notice when you read the inventory, I'll link it down below, is that you have a lot of nightgowns. Now, it's not something to sleep in. A nightgown is just a sort of old word for an evening gown or something that, something fancy. There is only one dress. Well, there's two actually. There's one dress that's not called a nightgown, but it's called a negligee. And I made that a couple of months ago. I'll link that somewhere up here. And then there's the gown. There's one gown that's it's not a nightgown, it's just called a gown of brown silk. Now, in the 1760s, 70s, a gown would probably be what we today sometimes call an English gown or a robe anglaise with back pleats that are sewn down into, so that they lie flat towards the back. And I thought, that'd be fun, be a nice thing to make. But I'm also very interested in experimenting a little bit with style, because what you do start to see, especially in the 1770s, is gowns that are created as an English gown with sewn down pleats in the back, but the front looks more like the Italian gown that I made last year. Link up here somewhere. With completely closed. They do not have a stomacher. They're completely closed. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to try and make a sort of not a fancy gown, but a sort of more everyday gown that is still pretty, still has, this fabric is so, the camera does not make it justice, it's so beautiful, so it's still going to be elegant and nice, but a bit more sort of everyday like wear, with a sort of mixture of styles, with a more old-fashioned back, the more modern front, maybe styled or trimmed differently than both my Italian gown and the negligee. So that's my plan, to make a brown gown. About Chicka Brown Gown. Wanna come along? So, seeing as this is an experiment where I'm combining the back of the English gown and the front of the Italian gown, I went ahead and I found my Italian gown pattern from last year. I decided to use that, not the sleeve pattern, because I wasn't very happy with the sleeves, they were a bit too big, so I'm using my sleeve pattern from the negligee I made earlier this year. But the front and the back bodice and the shoulder straps are gonna be from the Italian gown. I'm just gonna mount my gown differently onto the bodice lining. So I'm just using my paper pattern here, trying to keep it flat. I do have pattern weights, but I'm not finished with them yet. I started making them last year and I just haven't gotten around to finishing them. So I'm using my phone. Very classy. Stay classy. I've never made this kind of back before, so I'm leaning a little bit on the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking. I've just made up my bodice back lining, and I'm placing it on the sort of back fold of what will be my back fabric, and I'm placing it at a sort of slight angle. I'm not completely sure why we do this. I think it's to kind of give our back pleats a flying start, to make them really sort of pop and flow smoothly into the skirts. But I'm not sure. We'll see how it looks. Just making a line there, just drawing a line and pinning along it. And then I went and I backstitched along that sort of slightly askew angled line. Now what's on the right hand is actually where I'm pinning, is actually the fold. This fabric is folded. So it feels kind of weird to make a seam along a fold, but there's a reason to this madness. So this is showing the placement of my bodice lining against the fold a little more clearly. As you can see, it's fairly angled, straight at the top, about, I don't know, 2-3 centimeters from the fold at the bottom. And here's the seam, the backstitch seam. So I'm just measuring 5 centimeters up from the end of that seam and marking that point. Because this is where I'm going to cut my bodice from, to make it lay flat against my back. So marking, I don't know, 2 or 3 centimeters up from that mark and making an angled line. This is where my skirt will become my bodice, so to speak. So I'm just going to go in with some small sharp scissors and cut that angle almost to the seam line, but obviously not across it, because that would defeat the purpose of a seam. Now that I've got that little angle, I'm going to go up and cut open the fold. Otherwise my back will be a very sort of bulky, messy thing, and I don't want it to be. I want it to be flat and neat and tidy and lovely. So having cut open almost to the top, I'm just pressing out the back seam, and as you can see, where we cut that angle, that kind of becomes a little pleat. Isn't that smart? It's so clever. I love when dressmaking, when making clothing is clever, because I firmly believe that people who lived before us were just as inventive and smart and clever as we are, and would not make things unless, wouldn't use methods unless there was a reason for it. And here the reason is that we get a lovely little back pleat. So now we're gonna mount the fashion fabric onto our bodice lining, placing them wrong sides together, and making sure that the bottom, the hem of the lining covers the pleat at the bottom,
of the bodice, and also making sure that I actually have enough fabric to cover the entire bodice, the shoulder straps and everything. Well, not the shoulder straps, but the shoulder edges of my bodice lining. So I'm just gonna pin that in place, and then going up I'm pinning, making sure that the seam on the lining matches up with the seam on the fashion fabric, so that everything is straight and will hang nicely on my body. So having pinned all that in place, you can start to see how the back pleats will look. You can see that we already have a tiny little sort of inverted box pleat in the middle back, in the center back. So now it's time to go in and actually stitch the lining and the fashion fabric together. I've seen this referred to as the stitch in the ditch method, where you make sure that all your stitches go through the seam on both sides. That way you get an almost invisible row of stitches, which is very, very clever. Having attached our lining to the fashion fabric, making sure everything is straight and smooth and beautiful, it's time to start making the famous back pleats. To make sure that the dress flows nicely over my my underwear, my bum pad and my petticoats, I'm going to mark about 5 centimeters up from the bottom of my lining, and I'm only going to stitch the pleats to the lining down to there. From there on, I'm just going to stitch the pleats to themselves, so to speak. Now, there's no hard and fast rule how to make these pleats, as far as I understand, but pleats in the later period tends to be more narrow, and since I'm going for a sort of 1770s style, I thought I'd make mine fairly narrow. I've seen some that are super narrow, they're only like a centimetre or 2 wide. So just pinching fabric, making a nice looking fold, nice looking pleat that will you know, make a nice shape, tapering it down towards the waist. And when I'm happy with the shape, just go in and pinning it in place. It seems like the common thing is to have 2 pleats next to each other, sort of 2 pleats on each side of the center back seam. So I'm making the second pleat as well, trying to make that, you know, at least as narrow or maybe even a little bit narrower than the one in the middle, and pinning that in place as well. And then of course you have to make matching pleats on the other side of the center back seam, but this took a bit of fiddling and messing about, but I'm fairly happy with the end result. I think they look nice and very appropriate for the late sort of 1760s and 1770s. This is how they look on my mannequin. Now of course there's like way too much fabric bunched up around the waist. All of this is going to be pleated into the bodice as a skirt. I'm going to remove quite a bit from the sides, but all in all I am fairly happy with the look of my pleats. I think they look nice and appropriate, and I'm ready to start stitching them down, as well as add a tape to the back to make sure that the back stays sort of well, close to the body. I'm just using very simple prick stitches here to to sew down the pleats, and through all layers, because this is almost up the neckline. So here I'm stitching through all layers of silk and the linen lining. I'm also attaching a sort of waist tape thing to the back to just help keep that back towards my back, the small of my back. I have a bit of a sway back, so gowns tend to sort of hang away from my back, which isn't what I want with this gown. So I am trying to make sure that doesn't happen. So this is the neckline, and as you can see I have way too much fabric, so I'm just cutting away the excess. This is so satisfying, and it's not as thick as it was with the negligee, so it's you know, it's a fairly simple process of just cutting away the excess fabric at the neckline. I am also cutting away the excess fabric at the sides of my bodice. I've just sort of squared out from a bit above the waistline. Sorry, a bit below the waistline. And I'm just cutting a straight line, and I'm gonna cut up along the side seam. This is gonna be the side seams of the bodice. I am also cutting along the lower, sort of the curve, the waist curve of the back bodice. This was a bit scary to do, trying to make sure I didn't cut too far or cut into my pleats. As you can see, I'm cutting so far that the end of the cut is kind of hidden under the outer pleat. Now this is going to be a major weak point, so I'm just gonna secure that with a safety pin while I'm sort of fiddling around and trying on my gown, just to avoid that sort of ripping and tearing my gown. I've also done some cheating. Without you watching, I finished lining the front bodice pieces. It's very simple. I just did it the same way I did with the Italian gown last year. I will try and link that somewhere. And I've just pinned on the shoulder straps to the front. I used a small sort of whip prick stitch around the edges, and I've only sewn them together up until that point, because from that point backwards I am going to sandwich my skirts into my bodice. So this is my first sort of real trying on. This is to make sure everything looks right, everything looks as it should do, and also to measure where I want my pocket slits, because I've decided I want pocket slits. This is a more sort of everyday gown after all, and a girl needs her pockets, so let's make some slits. So I'm just trying to find my pocket, marking where that is on the bodice, so I know where to make my my openings in my gown. And this is, I will pleat my back skirt to this point, and then the front piece of the skirts will be pleated from that point and onto the front of the bodice. Happy with the fit, I went in and I stitched the linings together using a small hem stitch from the inside. I've just folded one lining over the other, and I'm hem stitching the two together. And I then folded the silk over the side seam, and I'm just prick stitching that down through all layers to make it sort of nice and the evenly curved side seam. I cut some self fabric bias binding, not bias enough as it turns out, but it works just to bind the neckline, and then I can move on to pleating the skirts. So this is my back. As you can see, it's fairly narrow. I've just folded the seam allowance up and basted it so that it's hidden under the outer pleats, and I am ready to start pleating the skirt onto the bodice. And I've made loads and loads of tiny little knife pleats moving forward. I just pinned them to the lining. I know the American Duchess guide says to sew them to the fashion fabric first and then to the lining. That makes no sense to me. So I've sewn through all layers from the lining side first, and then I am going to lap the bodice fashion fabric over. But before I get to that point, I am going to stitch my front skirts to my back skirts, and I'm just doing that very simply using a running back stitch. I'm also leaving about 20-25 centimeter openings at the top and hemming those as well to give me some pocket slits. And the front skirt is pleated into the opening between where I marked my pocket opening and where I've started sewing the fashion fabric to the lining of the front bodice. And I'm just folding them back, pinning them in place. I don't use maths for this. I sort of just fold and pin and fold and pin and fiddle with it until I'm happy. Which I think is the period method. Mantua makers in the 18th century probably weren't sitting around doing complicated mathematics. They were just, doing it until it looked pretty. So here's my pocket opening, and here's my pleats. And these two I stitched on from the inside first, through all layers from the lining side, and then I turned everything around and I stitched the bodice fashion fabric to the pleats using a applique stitch, and that way it's almost invisible, like you can barely even see stitching from the outside. It's really quite beautiful, and especially on this kind of silk that shows all stitching really clearly. It's a very revealing fabric in that way. So we're getting close to done. The pleats, the skirts are done, sewn on from the inside and the outside. We have our pocket openings, one on each side. We have stitched the side seams of the skirt, so the only thing that really remains now is hemming and trimming, and of course the sleeves. So the hemming, I will even out the skirts, curve the front skirts a little upwards. And this is my hem. I've used horsehair linen. I think I have shown in detail how I hem my skirts in a different video, and I'll try to find that and link it up below. If not, I'll show you in greater detail next time. Further on, I attached my shoulder straps using a back stitch just to make them secure and a bit elastic, because they're going to take a bit of strain. I cut away some of the excess fabric because all of this is going to be hidden under my fashion fabric shoulder straps, and I don't want... Basically, I want as little bulk as possible as a general rule, and especially sort of on top of your shoulders where everything is very visible. So with the shoulder straps all the shoulder strap lining sewed in, I went ahead and I pre-made my sleeves. I made them completely finished, even trimmed them a little bit, as I'll show you later, and went and stitched those in using a back stitch, and using my sort of favorite method for 18th century sleeves, where I set them into the lower half of the armscye, the bodice as it were, not the shoulder strap, and then I pin them to the shoulder strap and try on and adjust them, because it's usually the top half that needs adjusting. So this is an example of a sleeve that needs adjusting. It looks crooked and turned and yeah, plain no good. This sleeve, on the other hand, I have already fiddled with. As you can see, it looks a lot better, a lot tighter. There's still some room, but I mean there has to be. If you look at portraits from the period, there's always a little bit of creasing in the sleeve, and you need that to be able to actually move your arms around. So all in all, I think I'll redo the other sleeve to look like this one. This is a good sleeve, a sleeve that I am happy with. I give this sleeve a thumbs up. Using kind of the same method I did with the skirts, I'm stitching from the inside, from the lining side, through all layers of the sleeve and the shoulder strap lining. And then I go in and I place the shoulder strap on top, the shoulder strap from the fashion fabric, and stitch that onto, covering all the seams and everything, all raw edges and everything I want to hide. So with that done, I removed my basting stitches, I applied some self fabric trim to the neckline, and I took it for a spin in my local English 18th century garden.